Welcome to our service video on how to remove and install front wheel bearings. Now there are many reasons you might want to do this, possibly to upgrade to new higher performance ceramic bearings. You might just want to check and take a look at the quality of your bearing to see if it's rusty. When we received our brand new Catrike 559s, there were 12 bearings that we inspected. 2 bearings had no grease and were rusty, 6 bearings had no grease and weren't rusty, and 4 bearings had just the right amount of grease and weren't rusty. Another reason for removing your front wheel bearings is to give them a good general service, to get out all the old dirt and old grease that's inside them and repack them with fresh grease. This will allow them to last longer and perform better. But before we do that, let's talk about the front hub where the bearings are held. There's 2 parts of the hub. There's the outer side and there's the inner side of the hub. The inner side of the hub is the part that faces you while you're on the trike riding. Now let's look at the inside of the hub itself. There are 4 parts that make up the bearing component system. There are 2 bearings, that's part A and C. There's a center spindle, and then there's a cap on the end of the spindle. In this video, we're going to go through the process of how to get all 4 of these parts out of the hub, and then clean them and put them back together. The tools you need to do this service are very simple. I use 2 small blocks of plastic, a small one and a slightly larger one. You can certainly use blocks of wood if you like. The small one I use to tap the bearing in from the top, and the larger block I put underneath the hub to protect the table as well as the hub. You're going to need some grease or some oil. That provides a little bit of lubrication and stops the gilding effect between dissimilar metals between the bearings and the hub itself. You're going to need a plastic camping hammer. Now I make this very clear. Do not use a wooden hammer. Do not use a steel hammer, nothing like that at all. The plastic is very gentle on all the parts and won't damage anything. You're also going to need a few shop rags, and Q-tips always come in handy. Step 1. Your wheel cannot be on your trike while you're trying to do this service. To remove your wheel, simply lift up on the skewer lever end, rotate the cap end of the skewer counterclockwise until it comes off, and then pull out the skewer and the axle assembly. Make sure you have a good hold of the wheel while doing this, and slowly lower the wheel carefully out of the brake caliper assembly. Next, you have to remove the brake rotor. This is a very simple process. There are 6 T25 bolts in most Avid rotor assemblies. Simply remove all the bolts, and the rotor itself will simply slide off. To start the process of actually removing the bearings, you start off by removing the cap on the top that's indented to where the rotor plate was just removed. What I like to do when I'm trying to lift up on this cap is I simply put my thumb in the center and I lever it upwards. On the inside of this cap there's an O-ring. That O-ring is what allows this cap to stay on the silver spindle you see sticking up. I check for any kind of wear or damage to it and little bits of metal that could show that something else has gone on. I then give it a good cleaning. The first bearing to come out is the outer bearing of the system. Now you're going to need one more tool for this, and I haven't told you about it. If I was to try to tap it out at this point, the bearing would just go down into the table. However, my secret tool is a roll of toilet paper. Place the wheel on top of the roll of toilet paper and just tap on the little silver knob that sticks up, or the little part of the spindle. A few taps and out she comes. The top of the spindle in this image shows a shoulder that has been machined into it. With the shoulder portion facing upwards, as well as the outside of the hub facing upwards, place the spindle back in, give the spindle a few taps, and the next bearing will be out. As we tap the wheel or the hub with this hammer, it doesn't cause any damage. It's a lightweight plastic camping hammer. It never has damaged any bearing that I've ever worked on. And out comes the final bearing. So now we've got both bearings out. The inner bearing actually has a large inside diameter, and this fits over the end of the spindle that has a shoulder on it. On the other end, the outer bearing of the system actually just sits up against the spindle itself, and on top of the spindle we have our little cap. There are all the parts as they've just been removed. Next, it's time to clean and inspect the hub. I start off with using Q-tips to clean out the inside of the hub. The interesting thing about the Q-tip is the Q-tip also can get caught on any sort of damage that's down in this race area and kind of show me if there's a problem somewhere. I use Q-tips, I use rags, and if I need to, I also use some isopropyl alcohol to thoroughly clean the hub. This is the outer side of the hub, the machined race portion of it, where the outer bearing sits in, and it's perfectly smooth. Somebody's done a good job putting the bearing in on that side. However, on this side, because the bearing is actually narrower, it's a much harder bearing to put in. And there's actually a lot of ring-shaped scratches or damage on the inside of this race. And this brings us to a good point. Should you use a bearing press to put bearings in, or shouldn't you? All bearings have a problem of rocking as they go into their race. And it's the job of the person installing them to make sure that that doesn't happen, that they're properly aligned. I personally have found that doing this with a press, I've got a greater chance of possibly damaging the insides of the races. This particular bearing was put in, and this is a brand new wheel, and there's lots of bad ring damage as this particular bearing went in. It obviously rock and rolled all the way down the inside as it went in. Also, while I was inspecting it, I also spotted that there was a lot of metal shaving debris on the inside of that side of the bearing, meaning that whoever put this in actually damaged the inside of the race as they were putting the bearing in. And all this damage happened by somebody with a press. My preference is a little mallet and a little block of plastic. Works great. The inner bearing is the first bearing to be installed, but how do you know which is which? The inner bearing has a larger diameter hole in the center. It is also not as thick. In contrast, the outer bearing is a wider bearing with a small hole in the center. You're going to need some PPL1 or some kind of lubrication on the exterior of the bearing and inside the race. You just need a very small amount of this. What I've actually done is I've put some on and then I've wiped most of it off. There's just a slight film there. Also, I like to check the bearing to make sure it freely moves, that there's no problem with the bearing itself, and making sure that there's no dirt or debris down in the race. When I put a bearing in, I go through a process of aligning the bearing with the race it's going into. Now, how I do this is I'm trying to find a position where the bearing fits best and sits level. Obviously, that's not it. It's crooked. What I keep doing is I keep removing the bearing, giving it a quarter of a turn or a little bit of a turn until I find just the right spot where the entire bearing is touching the top of the race and is now lined up ready to go in. Once I finally find that spot, that looks pretty good, I then start to go through the process of tapping it in. My little mallet is amazing and doesn't damage anything. I give it a few taps, I take a look, and that one started to go in crooked. You can see how it's happened there. Now, before any actual damage occurs, I remove the bearing and start the whole process again. I relocate the bearing into the top until I find the perfect spot where it's nice and level. That seems to be another great spot. I quite often give it a few taps with the mallet first before I start to use the ring, just to kind of start it to get seated in there. Now, for some reason, if it's a little crooked and I can't get it out with my fingers, I just then use the spindle and push the bearing back out the other side. I continue to go through this process of rechecking the bearing to make sure that it's still moving smoothly, wipe out the area where it's gone into to make sure that I've not actually damaged any of the metal on the inside of the race and have metal fragments in there. And I go through the same process again, trying to find that perfect spot where the bearing lies level and flat. Once again, I seem to have found it. This time I'm going to start with my little plastic block. I normally start with the plastic block when the bearing is so perfectly square. Now, as I'm looking at this bearing, I can see about a 0.5 millimeter, or pick up with my eye about a 0.5 millimeter of squaring difference. It's going in pretty square, but I just kind of gently tap all around. I keep lifting it up to my eye to make sure that it's going in square. And if for some reason I find that there's a place it's not, I tap on the edge of the bearing. So I'm not tapping on the whole bearing, I'm just actually tapping just kind of on its very edge to try to get it down just that tiny, tiny bit. This is the harder of the two bearings to do because it is narrow. It has a tendency of wobbling on its way down. Take your time, be gentle, don't use a metal hammer or punches or anything like that. Just use this little plastic camping hammer and slowly but surely you'll tap her down. Keep looking for it to be completely flat and square as you're doing this. I always give it a couple of taps, and then I check the bearing again to make sure she's going down square. And I just continue this process until she's all the way down. Almost down, we just need a little bit more tapping. I just keep tapping her down till it's perfect. And I might need one more crack at her. At this point she's level, but we actually need to indent it more into the hub, and along comes the cap. What we're going to do is perfectly center the cap in the center of the hub and tap it a little bit, and that'll take the bearing the rest of the way down. So I keep tapping on the little cap, not quite down yet, almost there though. What we're trying to do is seat this bearing all the way down to the bottom of the race that it's sliding into. And there we have it. Now the bearing is seated down enough that the cap actually has a lip to sit into. I now do a quick check to make sure the bearing moves okay, as well as I check for any filings that might have come off the inside of the race as I was sliding the bearing in. This would show that I've actually damaged or taken metal off the inside of the race, and that would be a bad thing. This bearing slid in perfectly, and I didn't damage the race. Next it's time to install the hub bearing spindle. The spindle shouldered end is what gets placed in first, and ends up going through the center of the inner bearing. Give it a little push, and she clicks right into place. I then go through a process of turning the spindle in the bearing just to make sure that it functions correctly. Oops, I pushed the spindle out. Just push her back in if that happens. I'm just checking for smoothness, and this spindle and bearing works great. The next, it's time to install the outer bearing. The outer bearing fits down inside its race and actually ends up bumping down at the inside of the race and comes really close or even touches the spindle. It's the center portion of this bearing that actually may or may not make contact with the center of the spindle or with the spindle itself. To actually install this bearing, get out your secret toilet paper roll tool, check to make sure the bearing is moving correctly, and give it a light oil or grease, as well as the race itself. Once again, I go through the same process of trying to align the bearing, giving little turns till I get it perfect. In this particular case, it was up just a tiny bit on one edge, so I decided to just tap it a little bit with the hammer, and I got it absolutely perfect, ready to go. Once it's perfect, on goes the block of plastic, or maybe wood, and I start through the tapping process. I found a little spot that was high, and I tapped it down a little bit more. Once again, on goes the plastic. Now, an interesting thing is going to happen at some point with this bearing. With wider bearings like this, you're all of a sudden going to feel that the bearing is just going to take off and drop really smoothly into the race. And that's a really good thing. The longer the bearing, the greater chance you have of actually feeling when that happens. And it's pretty cool when it does. Once again, I'm taking my time to make sure that it's going down square, and I just keep going through the process of tapping. A little bit and a little bit at a time. The process takes time, so don't rush it. Take your time, use a plastic mallet, use a wooden block or plastic block, and you'll find that everything will work just great. As you can see here, it's going down nicely. Now, a lot of people, once again, might talk about you should be using a bearing press. I've used bearing presses in the past, and they're great tools if you have a really good one. However, not all bearing presses are the same. So my personal preference, and it's never failed me, is using a plastic block with a plastic hammer. And I take a look for any sort of debris between the bearing and the spindle. There wasn't any. Next, I go through a process of seeing how well the bearings move both independently and together. And I want to feel to make sure that everything is moving very freely. I double check to make sure that I've not damaged the inside of the races and had any shavings end up between the bearing and the spindle itself. I finish cleaning her up. Then I gave her a good spin on my fingers again to make sure she's running perfect, and she was just running great. Next on is the cap on the end of the spindle. First, I wipe off the spindle itself of any sort of debris, and then I simply slip the cap on and give her a good push. Once it's on, it goes click and it's in place. Give her a good spin on your fingers to see if it rolls perfectly. This one feels absolutely amazing, and that's the end of that. Now let's talk about possible issues that could happen when you actually do the spin test on your fingers. when you do the spin test, you're looking for smoothness, you're looking for everything to move great. But because you're talking about 4 independent parts, there may be a slight fit issue as you've pressed these in. One piece doesn't line up with another, or maybe you've actually got debris, or maybe even some extra grease that you haven't wiped off, stuck in between all the parts. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 4 parts and how they actually all fit together perfectly to make the perfect unit. We're also going to talk about problems. Now the first problem and the easiest problem to solve is wobbly wheel issues. A wobbly wheel issue is when you spin the wheel on your fingers, you feel this wobbly effect to one side, and it's actually because the spindle is not lining up perfectly with the outer bearing. And the problem exists because the spindle is only being held by the inside bearing, and this creates a bit of a problem where the spindle can actually be slightly crooked. In this image, we see that the spindle is actually offset just a little bit. Now to solve this problem, you simply take the axle and slide it into the bearing. Now in this particular case, I'm doing it from the outside, which means I'm already making contact with the spindle right away. However, if you can't get it in from the outside, try from the inside and do a bunch of wobbling to make it get in there and get working. From the inside, you'll eventually get to the point where you're going to get stopped by the bearing as it bumps up against it. At that point, a little bit more jiggling will get you right through. No matter what side you push the axle through from, once it's through and you spin it on your fingers, the problem will be solved. There will be no more wobble. It's pretty amazing. Next, we're going to take a look at the inner bearing. If the inner bearing, as you're putting it in, gets hung up and won't go all the way in, it could be metal debris from a crooked bearing going in, or it could be just some extra grease. What will happen is you won't be able to push the bearing down, and when you go to put in the inner spindle, what you may find is when you put the cap on, the cap won't actually recess down beside the hub. The best thing to do here is just disassemble the unit again, clean it all up, and put it back together. Sometimes you'll also run into a problem where the spindle gets blocked. So what will actually happen on the inside bearing is you have blockage on the inside bearing, but you give it more pressure, and that blockage then goes inside in the area where the spindle would normally sit. As you put the spindle in, what you'll find is that it'll get tightened up against these fragments of metal or possibly lubrication, and when you try to put the outer bearing in, it won't quite work. Now, if you manage to push the outer bearing in more, you really create a system where everything gets locked up, that everything's very, very tight. So if your wheel, when you try to spin each part independently, is very tight, this is probably the reason. Another difficulty might happen, your outer bearing isn't going in all the way. Now this is a carbon copy of the problem we just talked about on the inner bearing. However, as you're putting the outer bearing in, if you get debris happening, it won't go in all the way. If you manage to push that debris out of the way by pushing the bearing in just a little bit more, what you'll end up with is the similar type of reaction where you've got material or lubrication between the spindle and the bearing. Once again, this will jam up everything where the spindle doesn't spin freely, or you might feel a grinding effect. And when you go to put the cap on, the cap will still go on, everything will still go together, but it just will not feel smooth. The best thing to do in this particular case is just disassemble the whole thing again, wipe everything down and start over. Just because you may take off a little tiny bit of metal on the inside of the hub as you're putting them on, doesn't necessarily mean you've destroyed the hub. It's still usable. You can still keep putting it back together and taking it apart and cleaning it. You just don't want any contamination between the parts when it's all done. This will create stickiness and the bearings and the hubs just won't move correctly. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it's been of some help. I've tried to make as much sense of it as I could. If you have any comments, please let us know what you think. Once again, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. See you on the trail.